Good evening and welcome to InDemand. I'm Trudy Kerr.
And I'm Jane Dennis, and tonight we are talking about women making change. One thing we know is that change is inevitable, but how much do we really influence the world in which we live? Tonight we talk to two women active in shaping the world and Malta.
Absolutely, and tonight we're joined by two wonderful guests. We're joined by Astrid Vella, passionate environmentalist and campaigner, and also by Dr. Carla Camilleri, who is the Assistant Director at human rights organisation Aditus.
First up, we speak with Astrid. Hello, Astrid. Welcome. Lovely to have you here and talking about women making change, and who better to talk to about that in Malta. And I love the way that you've coordinated your outfit so perfectly with the set.
Totally unintentional.
Well, you look absolutely gorgeous. Now, briefly, can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Well, we are a group of volunteers who set up this association that lobbies for an improved quality of life in Malta. So our basic tenet is environmental health. Now we see everything in terms of this environmental health. So whether it is saving old buildings or the countryside or trees, that is what we're after, because we believe that in Malta we're surrounded by old buildings. So that is our natural context, and it's far better to preserve them than to have them knocked down to make more empty apartments, to add to our 40,000 empty apartments, and have people all feeling oppressed, and also because overdevelopment brings about mental health problems. So it all comes back to health.
Okay.
Can I ask you though,
Yes.
and it comes back to, we started off on this same foot, it starts off with an absolute classic. We often ask wonderful women who come on the show, what do you do? And they say, this is what we do.
Yes,
what do you do? Because this is about, I mean, how much of this is about you?
Well, I am a juggler. I am.
I want to see that.
Yes,
quick, get something.
My role is coordinator. So I basically keep the plate spinning, and I dash frantically from one to the other, and just as I've got one spinning, the other one is about to fall.
That I can associate with, yes.
So we've got a number of projects, so I make sure that they keep on running. We hold a lot of cultural events, which are very important to make people aware of our culture, because a lot of Maltese are very keen to know more about their culture, because many of us didn't even learn much at school. I personally didn't learn Maltese history. I learned European and British history. So that was a big vacuum until I went to university. Wow. Yes.
I know, when I first came to Malta, I was living in Burgu, and I was fascinated by the history.
Burgu,
And so I went out and bought every history book that I could, because it is amazing. And I keep banging on about the fact that this country is so pivotal in twice in history. It's changed the course of history. It's just incredible. But you're saying that you know that a lot of people are not maybe familiar with that.
Oh, but they want. There's a big thirst for this knowledge, and also amongst expats. We've got a huge following with expats, and in fact they come to a lot of our events. We hold lectures, very well attended lectures. We hold heritage walks in old villages and towns.
Now that's interesting that you're saying about expats being really interested in it. I mean, it's something that interests me, and I think when you visit a country, a lot of people want to go and see the history and want to understand how that country's evolved. How is that for the local community then? Do you think that there's less interest then with the Maltese in that field?
Now, that's a really good question, and it has to be seen in the context always of our history. few people realize that we are one of the longest colonized places on Earth.
Right.
Because we've been colonized uninterruptedly for 2,000 years. Now, every colonizer left their own imprint and had no interest in promoting Maltese culture.
Yes.
So for all that time, the message that the Maltese received was that it paid them to imitate the foreign
I understand, yeah.
ruler. So, I mean, very few people realized that in something like the 18th century, Maltese families, certain Maltese families, top Maltese families, spoke French among them.
That's right.
Yes.
Of course they did.
And,
Yes.
and there are actually letters in archives, say, from mothers to their daughters in French. Maltese mothers to their daughters.
Wow.
Yes, yes. So then it was obviously Italian and English, and that spread also to architecture. Until recently, Maltese vernacular architecture wasn't appreciated at all. In fact, our very, very first campaign was about a vernacular building, that is a local building, and people kept on telling us, oh, what do you see in it? It's plain, there's no sculpture. It's not Baroque, basically. If it isn't carved and if it isn't, you know, very fancy, it's worthless. No, that's Maltese vernacular architecture in the unlikely setting of Slema.
So, but we're talking about making change, but we're referring back to history quite a lot here. And we're talking about how you want to preserve something. Is it because the natural inclination now to change is change for something you perceive to be not a good thing?
Well, we perceive it to be not a good thing, not because we don't believe in progress, not at all. But the word development, as we use it in Malta, doesn't necessarily mean progress. Because if with development you're getting overdevelopment, you're getting a huge increase in air pollution and all the traffic jams that we're seeing. So people don't realize that air pollution contributes, we all know it contributes to asthma and lung problems, but people don't realize that it is the cause of 25% of our fatal heart attacks. 25%
Wow.
due to exposure to toxic emissions, to car exhaust. And it contributes to cancer, dementia. This dementia, this epidemic of dementia that we're seeing, it's contributed to by the
So you've
fine
got,
particles.
You've got a
in
lot of
traffic.
space there that you're talking about in terms of our environmental reach. Was
Yeah.
there a catalyst then, when we're talking about you specifically? Was there something that made you think, okay, now it's time for me to do something about this? And what was that thing?
Well, I've always felt I should be doing something.
Right.
And, you know, giving something back to society. And I never quite knew what, or felt sort of prepared for it. Because in Malta, unfortunately, and that is part, always going back to history of our makeup, it's a very hierarchical society. So unless you had some doctorate or unless you were, you know, very highly qualified, you were supposed not to take the lead. And it was felt that, you know, ordinary people that couldn't have a respected opinion. And so after I went back to university and did Baroque studies as a second degree, that opened my eyes to everything that we were losing. And then I felt prepared to go public. And then, obviously, I got slammed because I didn't have a doctorate and I wasn't an architect or a lawyer. And that led us to really appreciate the public input because, honestly, we get some of our best contributions from the public. The phone-ins, such down-to-earth, common sense, comments, solutions, outlooks. I always say that is so important and that the people are starting to speak out. We came out with this slogan. Our first rally was under the banner of stand up and be counted. And ever since then, that is reverberating.
I'm going to come back to you again as Astrid, because suddenly talking to you and listening to you, your passion comes across so well. You're suddenly talking about something that you've obviously feel extremely passionate about.
Yes.
And you're also talking about being, your phrase was stand up and be counted. Now that's not always a popular thing to do.
Especially not in Malta.
And especially, I would say worldwide, as a woman, that might be a challenge as well. How have you found that? Has there been anything particular that's affected you standing up and being counted in Malta and as a woman? Is there anything that sticks in your mind about that?
Yes, yes. I think in Malta it's obviously harder because there was a big prejudice. I mean, wherever one went, there were mainly men, always on talk shows. I'd be the only woman, and especially at MEPAD. I remember my very, very first MEPAD case. The architect there in charge, I stood up and said my bit, and the architect turned to the board and told them, "What? You're going to believe this woman?" It would have been comical if it weren't so tragic. And that was my christening of fire.
Good. And how long ago was that?
That was 8 years ago.
And has things changed? I mean, are
Yes.
you seeing change?
Yes, yes, yes.
And in what respect? You're saying
Things-
about the environment, or about, you know, even as you as a woman who's passionate and speaking out, is there more respect for what you're doing?
I think there's definitely more respect, and there's definitely more people speaking out, which is the most important thing. I mean, even just our last rally showed it when, I mean, we tripled the numbers of previous rallies. And just in general, people are realizing that as a member of the public, they have a right to speak out. We changed things as MEPA, where the public wasn't allowed to speak before, and we single-handedly, as a group, managed to break through that and get the public the right to see their files and to speak at hearings.
So again, thinking about you and the size of Malta and being a woman in Malta, where people
I
do
thought you were
tend
going to say the size of you.
Yes,
No,
the size
we're
of
not
you.
sizes
Do
on the
people-
show.
Do people notice? Is there something about being Maltese and speaking out that then allows you to have a label that allows you not to be Astrid Vella the person, but Astrid Vella the campaigner and the activist? Can you disassociate the two now? Do people have this idea of
It's
who
hard.
you are?
It's hard to disassociate the two, yes, yes. And of course, there's always that discrimination that when a man speaks out, he's assertive. And when a woman speaks out, she's aggressive, or there's an undercurrent of that. But, you know, you learn to live
But
with
you
it.
said, you mentioned that being in Malta. I have to say, I mean,
Yes.
I haven't lived anywhere else for the last 10 years. I've lived in Malta. But what you're describing is not unique to
No,
Malta.
no,
It's
it
actually, you know,
It
I've
isn't.
encountered that. I've always been one of those people that if there was something that I wanted to say, I've said it for my
Yes.
sins. But that courage and speaking out, it does come up with against confrontation anywhere, I would say.
Yes, but
you're
remember,
saying here,
we're a society where there were very few women in parliament, very few women on boards. We're talking up to 10 years ago. The situation is improving, I'm happy to say.
and isn't that fantastic that it is, and it's so encouraging to hear from you,
Yeah.
of all people who speaks out the most, as far as I'm concerned, that things are changing.
I'll tell you a lovely anecdote about how things are changing. A friend was in Gozo at the time when the new bishop of Gozo had shuffled round all the parish priests. And some parishioners weren't happy about that, and they went and protested outside the bishop's office with placards and walked up and down with placards. And these two old men across the road were there watching them, and one said to the other, "Look at that, look at that. It's all that FAA, putting ideas into people's heads, putting ideas above their station. You see, it's all the fault of that FAA. And that was priceless. I mean, we had absolutely nothing
You are
to do.
personally responsible for every bit of activism on this island.
But you've described something very well, that you have got influence across other areas. Is that sometimes misinterpreted? Is that sometimes?
Oh, I'm sure it is, but you know, it's their problem.
I like that. Every time I see a placard, I'm going to say that Astrid. Listen, I'm loving talking to you. I think we're having a great time, aren't we?
Yes, lovely.
And loving hearing your passion. We're just going to take a break for a few minutes. Then we're going to speak to Carla. We'll have a little bit more of a chat in just a minute or two. Go and make yourself that cup of tea and come right back here in just a few minutes.
Welcome back to InDemand, where we've been joined by Dr. Carla Camilleri, who works in the field of human rights. Welcome, Carla.
Thank you.
And absolutely, Carla, I'm astounded because the pair of you are so coordinated with the sofa. Jane and I are sticking out because we're not.
Yes.
Very, very nice to meet you.
Well, thanks for inviting us.
You're very, very welcome. First up, I guess, I would like to ask you, what do you do at your NGO? What is it all about?
So Aditus is a human rights NGO, and we focus on access to human rights in Malta. On a very legalistic basis. So I'm a lawyer, and Neil Falson, who's the director, is also a lawyer. So we have quite a focus on law and policy. So the idea is to change law and policy and also monitor how these laws are being implemented or not in Malta. So it's a monitoring role, it's a drafting role, it's a lobbying role, and we also have a pro bono section. So
can I be really naive and a bit daft here?
Try your hardest. Try your hardest.
Thanks so much. You're talking about human rights here in Malta.
okay.
Whenever anyone talks about human rights, I immediately think of maybe Africa or a country that's under persecution. Why on earth do we need someone looking after human rights, looking out for human rights here in Malta?
Well, I mean, Malta is party to a number of conventions, and they obviously have duties. Malta obviously has duties and obligations under these conventions. But for example, we were quite active in the LGBTI civil union drafting. So we believe obviously in the rights of everyone to have a private life, a family life. So that's the kind of human rights. There's the migration issue. We work a lot with asylum seekers and migrants. And there are also migrants who work in Malta who have rights and maybe find it very difficult to access them.
Do you think the term human rights has been hijacked a little bit to become something negative that prohibits lots of things? So people will see, when we talk about human rights, it's as though it's not a positive thing, but it's got negative connotations, that it stops us rather than moves us forward.
I think in the same way that feminism has sort of got a...
We've talked about this.
You know,
the
has sort of become a no word, you know,
Yes.
you're such a feminist, like it's an insult.
Yes.
So when obviously you say, I work in human rights, everyone's like, oh God, you know, I want one of these. So I think, yes, there could be a negative connotation, but we always try. We have a number of projects that tries to bring human rights sort of closer to people, for people to understand. So we have a lot of artistic projects, film projects, and showing that, you know, you have your rights too, and rights are there for you to be protected, and you can use them, and they're for you to enjoy. So rights to a healthy and clean environment, that's a human right.
Yes. So you worked as a corporate lawyer originally, and we were talking to Astrid about a similar thing, which is what made you decide to go from being a corporate lawyer over to the field of human rights?
Actually, when I was at university still studying, I used to, way back in 2002-3, when the migration phenomena started, first boat started in 2002, maybe 1-2, I started volunteering with the Jesuit Refugee Service, so that started it off, and I spent a couple of years until I graduated. And academically, that was always my main focus and interest. But then, in those days, civil society was not maybe that active, and the job opportunities were very limited. So it was, I basically was pushed into corporate to a certain extent by necessity, and enjoyed it. I don't have any regrets at all. And well, in 2011, we decided, Neil Falson, who's the director, and I, and another lawyer, who's our chairperson now, decided to form Aditus Foundation. Couple of years on, we developed, and there was an opportunity, and I took it. So,
I guess just listening to you as well, it harks back to something that Astrid said a few minutes ago, which was, to me, it was about women standing up and being counted and making a voice. Now, as Astrid quite rightly said, she had some challenges with that. Is that something that you've experienced, or is it because you're on the legal side that maybe there's been a... Because that's exactly what you said, Astrid, and I'm coming back to you, Carla, to say, because you are a doctor, do you get more respect even as a woman?
Yes.
well, I mean, no, not
Or do you get the same, she's a woman?
Yes, I'm trying to be a bit more positive, but it's very difficult. I mean, in every sector, you know, even specifically in the corporate field, you know, you're usually there. It's still, although there are many more female lawyers graduating, you're usually one of the few females around the table. So, you know, I've had people turn around like, can I have a coffee, please? Or
no.
And my boss, in all fairness, always took up for me and said, no way. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with making coffee. Don't
You've
really.
said, no, you've said to them, yes, you can. There's the kitchen. Yes.
And I don't mind. I enjoy coffee, and I would make
sure.
it. There's nothing wrong in that. Don't get me wrong. But you get sort of a kind of, you're at a lower sort of level, and even in the NGO field at times. I mean, once we were described as chickens, you know, all these chickens, women, you know, because we're a lot of women, and so we're the chickens.
Wowzers.
And those are the funny things, you know, but we do get a lot of back, especially from, because we work in the migration sector, which is very, very sensitive. We get a lot of internet bullying and trolling.
Trolling, yes.
Yes, so we get really bad comments online on Facebook, but sort of, I hope you get raped by... or I hope your daughter gets raped, or...
Wow.
And sometimes it's actually women telling women, I hope you get, you know, you deserve to be raped for your ideas. I mean, so I think I mean, don't get me wrong, everyone's pretty much targeted in some way or another, but I think women are targeted in a different way, in a more maybe violent way. If you know what I mean.
Good grief.
And a more oppressive way. That's
it's sort of you know, shut up and this is your place, or else you deserve the worst punishment on earth.
So aside from the bullying, though, does that kind of behaviour come through with people that they still expect you just to go away and be quiet, even as a lawyer, as Trudy was saying about being a lawyer, that it doesn't seem to give you a greater gravitas or status?
You have to obviously shout a bit louder.
Yeah.
I think, you know, I've been in meetings and they go, okay, maybe we should ask a lawyer. And I'm like,
hello.
You know, I know I'm small. You know.
You need to get yourself some very high heels.
Yes, well.
I mean, for me, I conditioned as a young person, I get nervous around policemen and policewomen, and I get nervous around lawyers. I get really careful of what I say, because I'm like, oh, well, they could sue me. They could sue me.
I feel like I'm lying when I talk to lawyers and policemen. I just automatically assume the default position that I'm not telling the truth, that I've got something to hide.
But that would, in my mind, would have given... immediately would have given more respect to what you're doing and what you're saying and what you're actually saying. Well, that doesn't necessarily
not
apply.
necessarily. No. I mean, you know, you just have to basically just persevere, and you know, you have a thick skin.
So when you talk about the change that you're making, we're talking about legal change. How much does legal change actually influence the cultural element across Malta? Because there's laws that go through and then people have to adhere to those laws. But mentally, does some of those changes accepted in society?
Well, I mean, I think a good example is the Civil Unions Bill. So, say 10 years ago, it was unimaginable. I mean, completely unimaginable. But because there was political will, civil society was pretty much behind it. It helped. I mean, the law just consolidated the change in a way, but the fact that it became law, that it was pushed, that it was supported by the government, made a big difference in mentality.
Yes.
And in people accepting it. Obviously, then compared to migration, when maybe there isn't so much.
And how do you manage that there? Because I think that there's a lot of things, particularly being part of the EU, that some countries, and that's not just Malta exclusively, are culturally not ready for or not happy with, because somebody in Germany, Britain, France, Spain have made that decision on their behalf. And then that becomes legislation in that country. So here in Malta, how do we move that forward to show that it's a good thing? Is it always a good thing?
Well, I mean, it depends on what. I mean, when we're talking about respecting rights, it would always be a good thing. But I mean, there are some laws that would, because Malta is a very different country to say Germany, would really affect us badly. But I mean, the idea is that you would lobby with your either MEP or with the commissioner.
And that's all about making change and being active as well, isn't it? And how active are people in that? Even in their counter activism. So even if it's a valid cause that perhaps doesn't sit with what you do, how much are people getting engaged in activism?
Well, I think more and more nowadays. I think there are many, and for such a small country, we have a lot of NGOs, which isn't always, I mean, in the sense it's good to work together.
Yes.
Because we're so small and you would need to consolidate your work a bit. But I think more and more people are getting used to this idea of, you know, I can make a change.
Yeah.
Even there was the massive protest, the environmental protest from Front ODZ, which isn't even an NGO. They're a group of people who came together, you know, and it was the biggest protest Malta has ever seen.
And in that kind of demograph, how many of them are women? I'm
Well,
not asking for statistics. That
no, I
sounded
mean,
like I was putting you in a corner then.
No,
but
no,
ish.
I'm trying to remember the people in front. Most of them are men, really. But a lot of women were there. So a lot of women would support, but maybe not be on the front line.
That's it. They're not in the lead.
I mean, there were a lot of women walking with their kids and with their families.
And I think women do tend to feel and identify with environmental issues
Quite
very,
strongly.
very strongly, especially because of their children. But then they're less, they come forward to take leadership positions less than men.
And you have a
difficult.
leadership position.
Yes, I'm assistant director at
So
Editors.
you've broken the mould there a little bit.
Well, yeah, in a way, yes. Although in the NGO field, I mean, there are quite a few women active, but more maybe on a services base, so more on the sort of social.
I was just about to ask that question because I'm going to listen. Friends of mine call me a feminist, but I have to say sometimes I have some backward thoughts. If I think about women activists, I automatically think of women looking after animals or supporting animal rights, because I grew up in the sort of 80s when that's what women did,
big.
burned bras and looked after animals.
I don't remember that time.
So I guess my question would be, are there some areas where women are more inclined to get involved, such as environmentalism? And are there some areas where women don't, like I mean, we had, on a recent show, we had 2 women who are directly involved in the migrant issue. And it was phenomenal to listen to them talking. And just like you, they stand up to be counted, knowing that there's going to be a consequence. But is there some areas that are maybe softer, that women are more, sort of lean more towards?
Well, I mean, yes, that's definitely. Children, I mean, anything, no, there's nothing wrong, obviously, but the whole the childcare, the helping children children, I would say, and education.
I think from our background, it's always the social groups that are favoured as seen to be more laudable. So anything that helps the poor, the sick, the disabled,
caring,
and children, that always seems to, people tend to gravitate more towards them as the accepted causes, and things like environment and human rights are more recent. So there's more acceptability, far more acceptability for the social causes. Things like mental health, those are all totally positive, while the rest are, are coming in now, but they started off as being controversial, and now they're gaining acceptance, I would say.
Well, that's interesting in the context that this idea that there is change against change as well. So even if things are controversial and aren't things that people necessarily want to support, you can be active against that as well. Yeah. So I think it's about the balance between where people get involved, but about making sure that they do get involved.
Yes.
And that women do that particularly, and understand exactly where their values are and what they can and can't do.
And of course, even in the areas that might be viewed as more controversial, there's a lot of work to be done that's very, very mainstream, like, heritage, fundraising, organizing events. One doesn't have to be on the front line of a rally. One doesn't have to go to do the lobbying. I mean, I'm sure that Adidas has its own events, just like we do. So we always need people to support that.
We're going to be back in a few minutes because I'm seeing that this is going to get to quite a lively discussion. We're going to go and pour a glass of wine because Jane likes that. Go and make yourself a cup of tea or grab yourself a glass of wine or a cup of coffee and come back and join us in just a few moments.
Welcome back to In Demand, where we are talking about the subject of women making change, and we're joined, I'm pleased to say, by Carla Camilleri and Astrid Vella, who work and are active in the field of environmentalism and human rights. And now we've got a glass of wine, and I always mention it.
Jane's happy now. Ladies, just before we came on the show, not only are you coordinated, you're also related. And I just want to, because we didn't know that.
Genetic.
I think they were on the phone together this morning. What are you wearing? What are you wearing?
No, pure coincidence.
But you are related as well.
Yes, as it happens, our grandmothers were sisters.
Well,
Okay, so you're sort of some distantly related cousins.
Do you know, not so unusual in Malta, though.
No.
We're third cousins. Although there's a big, I mean, Carla's much younger than I am, obviously, but my grandmother was the oldest.
Okay. Listen, I want to just touch on something that you mentioned in the last piece. Both of you highlighted this, both of you mentioned this. You talked about the fact as women who stand up and who are stood up and counted, you suffered some kind of attack or abuse or whatever. And not to describe it in detail, but how does that make you feel? How does that ever make you want to stop what you're doing, or does it feel personal?
Well, I mean, the small incidences at work, the small discrimination, it's I mean, you sort of laugh it off.
Yes.
So that's fine. Well, you know, you pass a comment back, or it's. I mean, you get used to it, but I think the.
Do you get used to it?
Yes, I think you do.
Do you?
You almost expect it.
Did it used to hurt? Did it used to hurt?
No, I used to find it a bit amusing.
Okay. And Astrid?
No, it doesn't bother me. I think I was very lucky that my father always made it clear that there was no distinction, yes, in our family, that I was expected to sort of get on just as well as my brother, which was not the norm for that time, because, I mean, it was girls were not pushed academically as much as they are now. So it was clear that I was expected to fulfill my potential. And in fact, this is something that comes back. You asked about motivating factors. And I think one can't totally eliminate sort of bloodline, even in our case.
Parents.
And in my case, it's very strange in my case, because my father died when I was quite young. And I had no idea how involved he was in saving old houses. None whatsoever, until an Englishman who was a colleague of his told me, well, I wouldn't expect anything different of you being Tony Mifsud's daughter. And I'm like, why? Because my father was involved in post-war reconstruction, and he said he was the only one who was fighting to save the houses rather than demolishing them.
So do you think that bravery and that sense of spirit then comes from him?
Yes.
And that you can easily shrug off these comments?
Yes, and he had a very strong sense of justice, which he definitely did pass on. And in our case, I mean, there is a lot of overlap, because people here are not aware of environmental justice, and it's a big issue. Like the areas that people live in would be better or worse environmentally, very much according to earning power and social issues. So certain areas, like the most polluted area, is the inner harbour area, for instance, that was until recently also a bit depressed as well, and that is a very, very highly polluted area.
Bring it back, because I think, and I'm interested in what you're saying, but I'm going to bring it back to the original question that Carla looked like she was about to say something back there, and we all went, but Carla, you were saying about you started off by saying, yes, the casual comments in the office, yes. You brush them off. And I have to say, that's always been my attitude, because you have to pick your battles.
Yes, exactly.
You have to pick your battles.
Some people won't, I mean, especially it's the older generation. If it's someone young, then you get more, it's more upsetting, obviously, and it's very rare. But the older generations tend to be a bit like that. But the internet comments, the trolling, that is quite upsetting.
So proper abuse.
I mean, we filed a couple of police complaints, but that is quite upsetting, and you feel slightly unsafe. Yes. So there was a time, you'd think twice before opening the office door.
Really?
So, yes.
And that vulnerability, do you think women are tougher in that scenario? Do you think there's a gender that makes you more vulnerable or tough against?
I think the gender makes, especially for this type of abuse, makes you more vulnerable. Maybe because I'm quite small, so I feel a bit unsafe. So, I
Okay.
mean, if someone knocked on the door, and I'm on my own in the office, it's just me. So,
Do you think that kind of abuse, or the fact that people, know that you even just being called names or hostility, if nothing else, it can be quite tiring. Do you think that stops women getting involved in being active? Do you think it has a negative effect on people getting involved in that kind of activism?
I think yes. I mean, especially since now there's so much social media and it's so instant and immediate that basically you can say anything on internet and no one really questions it. You can anyone can just write whatever they wanted. I mean, there are obviously legal consequences, but it's very instant. So they could upload a photo of you instantly and write whatever they wanted. We've had photos of us with our, these women were protesting for this and this. Let's hope they all get raped. So you do feel quite exposed, in a way.
And a question for both of you: is it possible, when you talked about going home and closing the door, and you talked about your strength that was given to you, passed on to you by your family environment, is it possible to distinguish between somebody being maybe outspoken against the cause and being outspoken against you? Do you? How difficult is that? So, for instance, you're both standing up to be counted about contentious issues, about issues which most people have an opinion about in Malta, but other countries as well. So when you go home, shut the door, you make your tea, whatever, and you can say, okay, that was against that issue, it wasn't against me personally, or is it personal?
I think it's a mix.
It's a mix, and I think the way you deal with it is different. So obviously everyone is entitled to their own opinion. So if it's against our aims and our objectives and our policy, and there's a good, clean discussion about it, that's fine. You can disagree with me. It's
Exactly,
fine. Let's engage.
Does it
But
affect you?
people use personal attacks to undermine the cause.
Right.
That's it. So they would attack you on a very personal basis, even one's family, as Carla said, online, in order even to put off others from doing that.
Of course.
Because people might say, oh, let them be the fools and be exposed to ridicule. I'm not going to do so. So
Does that happen more to women or men, or is it equal for people who are in activism?
It's
equal, yes.
Equal, but I think the abuse is different.
The abuse is different,
Yes.
okay.
Or the reaction would be different.
And how does it affect your personal lives?
I think it depends on your support system. I think we're probably both lucky to have very supportive husbands. So.
Do you think that, but if someone doesn't have that network of support, does it put people off getting involved?
Well,
It shouldn't. It shouldn't.
It would, though.
It's,
I think.
Well,
I mean, like everything in life, right? I mean, any career.
well,
I have to say, I agree. I do agree.
I I want to say no, because if we let it put us off, then those people will have achieved their aim. So I'm not going to give them that pleasure. In fact, that's always my reasoning. I'm not going to satisfy them by getting upset. I'm not going to play into their hands.
Is there a certain time? I mean, we touched on this earlier a little bit about the roles that you were saying that women in the 80s liked cats, and I'm paraphrasing here. Animals, and were burning their bras. Is there an acceptable face of volunteering and charity work and activism? And I do that not to make bunny ears about animals, but to say, is there an acceptable face of charity work here and a less acceptable face? And is there a generational or class divide about what people can and can't get involved in?
I think there is an acceptable. I mean, the more for women, I would say, where we talk about women, right? So I think the more acceptable form of activism or charity would be, helping the children, sick, old people, on a service base. The Florence Nightingale, Mother Teresa. Idea.
And do you think that's instinctive, or do you think that they're actively keeping away from more controversial
I think
themes?
people do keep away from controversial things, and Maltese people take excuses to keep away because of political overtones, and foreigners equally make excuses to keep away because they say, oh, we're guests in your own country. What they don't realize is that now we're all EU residents, we all have the same rights, and with those rights come responsibilities. So you are also responsible for preserving the environment of your host country, just as obviously we Maltese should be. But going back to what you said about taking roles in controversial issues, I think one of the main things holding people back is that they don't know what they can do, and they think that it is of necessity a very big undertaking. And they don't realize that you can go to an NGO and just volunteer even 3 hours a year, even.
Something's better than nothing, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's for us. It's like gold dust. I mean, there could be an art exhibition. There could be a walk that needs to be supervised. So we always tell people, we'll always find something that you enjoy doing. And it's such a help to the overall cause of saving Malta's heritage, saving Malta's trees, environment. You can do 3 hours a year, or 3 hours a day. For us.
And it must be a huge encouragement as well to know that somebody's said, right, I want to get involved and I want to support you in what you do. I mean, that must be, just from an external point of view, you must be like, whoa, that's such an encouragement.
Yes.
Good for you.
But I just don't want to undermine, obviously, all those women who are actually doing the hands-on work.
Absolutely.
And men.
Yes.
Of course,
Yes.
because they have to be done. And I think naturally human beings, or maybe women, tend to gravitate more towards the giving and the caregiving, which
and that has been
So
that's
the
been
basis,
the mold
exactly.
that Malta has been brought up with, established by the church centuries ago.
Yeah.
you know, the charity,
So
the
you know
giving.
that charity.
But then that also, I mean, to bring that right down to basics, that is women tend to be, without sort of, saying anything controversial that I shouldn't, but they do tend to be more caregiving. I mean, the women, that's how women are programmed.
Yes.
So doing what you're doing, standing up and being counted, I'm so going to shoot myself in the foot and say totally unfeminist things. But there is essential makeup between men and women. Men are, maybe the
I'm not sure about that.
go out and fight the bear, and that's the kind of
But
makeup.
I think women are fighting the bear.
Well,
now,
women
and I
now
think,
are.
But I personally believe that's because of the way that culturally,
Stereotype
when we,
push
when
you
we were,
away.
Yeah.
when we literally had to go out into the field and women were giving birth and women were breastfeeding children, that's how it had to be, because that's how it had to be.
Absolutely.
But I don't necessarily think that we've evolved naturally into that. I think that was just more practical way that it was, and that's how it is. But now we're entitled to go fight the bear, and I think we've just got as much inclination to go fight the bear.
And invested, there are a lot of men who maybe want to be in the caring profession, and they're pushed away because of the stereotyping, which I think is negative for both genders, because when you really put people in a slot, then people who don't actually fit the mold are just uncomfortable with who they are.
Yes.
And of course, that caring trait is what pushes us to do this. I mean, we wouldn't be doing it if we didn't care.
For
care
sure.
passionately.
But you could have chosen to do something a lot easier. Life could have been
It's true,
a
but
lot easier.
But there are plenty of people doing that, you see. We sort of stepped into a vacuum. We filled that vacuum.
Yes.
Well, I love my job, so I think there's no choice. I mean, it's
Right.
just that.
I mean, were you inspired? Were you ladies inspired by anybody? Because, for instance, you were talking about how times have changed, and then and now in Malta we also have a female president, so that there are people taking here in Malta positions of leading change or authority. But also, you look at globally, just off the top of my head, you look at Angelina Jolie, who has, whatever you think of her as an actress or her as a person, she is fighting a cause. So is there people that you've looked at that when on a bad day, when you've had a lot of, what do we call it, trolling or whatever?
Angelina Jolie and say, that's the no.
I do on a regular basis every night. That's where I want to be.
I would love to say, I would love to actually mention a woman, but when I look back, I think you know, and I would think Martin Luther King off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I know, it's...
Okay.
And it's strange. For example, I mean, this is quite totally different, but I have a fancy dress party and it is 80s characters, film characters. And I was trying to think of a woman in the 80s.
Yes.
Madonna? She didn't inspire you?
I've dressed up as her. I needed someone else. So I was like, okay, Madonna, no. Like a woman.
But it's
E.T., you know, not a woman. You know, there's the dog of Neverending Story, not a woman.
Yeah.
So it's
They're
it's
quite
very
random
difficult.
characters that you've gone for there. Interesting.
The animals.
Yeah, E.T., dog.
I would say no one needs to dress up as E.T. Let's leave E.T. right where he is.
But
He
think
or she.
of inspiring women of when I was a kid. There weren't that many.
Less so.
So.
No.
And that's kind of what we're trying to do here as well, which is there are great women in Malta doing
Role
some great
models,
things. And what we
yes.
find, and that Trudy alluded to earlier, when we talk to women and we talk about what they do, a lot of the time they say, we do this and this is what the cause is about. But it's very hard, we find, to get to the nub of why that woman is doing what she does. It's very much wider and much more about we and the collective and the cause.
And even as Astrid said, as you said, my darling, as we started this conversation, we found this so often throughout the season, is that we've had women who are doing phenomenal things. But you say, so what do you do? And say, well, we do this. And almost take a back step and don't come forward and say, you know what I'm doing? I'm fighting for human rights, or I'm standing up for the environment.
I did it, and it's
And women are like that. Inherently, that's how we are. And congratulations to you beautiful ladies for standing up and doing what you're doing. We have come to the end of this part of the show. I know, I could talk forever, but we actually aren't going to go anywhere. We're going to carry on talking, and that show will be going out on a Sunday night. That is us.
It's the wine.
From us. I haven't drunk any yet. From us
It's
this
not the
evening.
wine.
Listen, whatever you do, ladies, wishing you all the very, very best and the most success in what you do.
Absolutely. This has been In Demand on Friday, and we'll be back on Sunday with After Hours with these two great ladies as well. So make sure that you catch us then.
Absolutely. If you want to find out anything else about what we do on In Demand or the ladies that we interview, go and have a look on Facebook, facebook.com/In Demand Malta. Is that right?
Something like that.
In Demand TV Malta.
TV Malta, yeah. So this has been In Demand. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you Sunday, and we'll see you next Friday, where we speak to some more fantastic women.
Good night.